Well, hello. Hey, team. Good morning, Betsy. Good morning, Lisa. So good to be with you all. Um, Betsy, sorry about your cat. Betsy lost her cat yesterday. I won't make the whole talk about that. Don't worry. I know you want a little break from it, but I think you all know I lost my dog about a month ago. It's hard. We love our pets. I got a new puppy, and then this morning he was sick. Um, like he threw up. And like immediately when he threw up, I was like, oh, this is it. Right? Like I went straight to the darkest place. And I was like kind of doing like a check-in with myself later. And I was like, oh, I'm still very traumatized by this. Um, you put your dog down and after 11 years and it doesn't just like go away, even if you get a puppy. And the puppy was awesome. Although I did say, we named him Francis. I was telling someone we should have just named him Rebound. That would have been a really cool name for a dog. Just name him Rebound. And then people were like, oh, do you like basketball? Not particularly. But you named your dog Rebound. Yes, that's correct. He is our Rebound pup. But anyways, it doesn't change anything, right? It's just so tough. It's interesting. I think one of the most... Oh, good. Betsy's going to get two new... Listen, by the way, my tongue's a funny color because I've been eating Tic Tacs. So if you see that, you'll know why. I didn't even want to pretend it's something else. Just look at that. I didn't want to say anything, Betsy, but I was like hoping that you'd go Rebound as well, because man, it's a lonely time anyway, and any companionship we can have, and pets are the best. I'm not a big cat person, but if you like cats, then having those cats run around and be near you and do their thing is, and the great thing about cats, I'm a dog guy, but the great thing about cats is they are kind of doing their own thing. So you don't have to, dogs are basically codependent. They're always just looking at you, wondering what's next. And which I'm sick enough to like that. But cats are really like, they're kind of doing their own thing. And then every once in a while they'll check in with you and be like, okay. And then they'll walk away. I like that. I like that about cats. Yeah, you'll get one of your cats and name them Rebound. I like it. I like it. Good morning. Leslie is with us, joining us from Canada, from Canada. What a beautiful place. You're in Vancouver, right? Anyways, what a joy to be with everybody. I only have one question so far today. Dogs have owners, cats have staff, Betsy says. I got, and if you have questions, Leslie, if you want to throw a question at me, or Lisa's got one question for me that I'm going to work with, but Betsy, if you have any questions, you can ask as well. But I read something that said, a dog sees the owner, picking up their poop and taking them for walks and taking care of them. And the dog says, this person's a god. And this person must be a god. And cats see a person picking up their poop and feeding them and letting them out and taking care of them. And the cat says, this person does all this for me. I must be a god, So I think that's the distinction between cats and dogs. I also learned this. I'm going to talk about cats and dogs for one more second, and then we're going to talk about something else. But I also learned that cats understand home based on actual physical territory. So like your house is home for them, whereas dogs understand home based on people. So my dog didn't care where we went so long as he was with us or I was with him. Then he knew that he was whatever home was. If we'd go on vacation, we took him, he'd be fine if he had his bed and he knew that we were coming back. Then he was home. He didn't care. Cats base it on actual geography. So home is not based on us. It's based on the space. I found that fascinating. I really did. I want to read something to you from the Bible. Funny idea, right? We're going through the gospel according to Matthew. And let me start again. We're going through the gospel according to Matthew on Sundays. our lectionary, which is the fancy church word for our reading schedule, our reading calendar, we do one of the three synoptic, Matthew, Mark, and Luke gospels each year is devoted to one of those. And then John, the fourth gospel, is interspersed throughout each year, especially during holiday periods like Lent, Easter, Advent, and Christmas. Not a lot of John in Advent, but you see him in Lent and Easter a lot. In other places, John pops up. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and each year we do one of them. This year we're on Matthew. Next year we'll be on Mark. The year after that we'll be on Luke. And then the year after that we'll go back to Matthew. So it goes like that in a cycle. So we're on Matthew right now, year A. And so we're looking at all of these teachings of Jesus. We're looking at Jesus through the lens of Matthew. And Lisa asked me a question about Jesus and the Beatitudes. And I'm going to read the Beatitudes so that we don't all have to pretend that we know what she's talking about. But I think it's really helpful. But her question about the Beatitudes, when will the meek inherit the earth? When will the mourners be comforted? Is Jesus only teaching about heaven and or giving guidance about how we should now? Or is Jesus only teaching about heaven and or giving guidance about how we should now live? So I want to talk a little bit about the Beatitudes and a little bit about what Jesus' teaching is for. Not just there, but in general, his teaching. So let me just set the table a little bit here for Jesus in terms of his ministry, like what it means in Matthew, how Matthew lays out Jesus' ministry. The Beatitudes are the very first part of the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard of this in the Sermon on the Mount. The way that Matthew presents the Sermon on the Mount, and the reason it's called this, one is he's on a mountain, okay, problem solved. But the two is it's an extended discourse, which you don't see there in Mark or Luke in this particular fashion. You don't see an extended teaching. In Mark, towards the end of Mark, you see one that scholars call the little apocalypse, because it's essentially an apocalyptic prophecy that he enacts, that he foretells while standing in the shadow of the temple prior to his passion and death. That's a different thing. That's not the same as this. This is at the outset of Jesus' ministry in Matthew. And I want you to imagine that if Jesus had sort of like his opening salvo teaching, his mission statement, right? So when someone runs for office, right, their first speech is sort of giving us a defining characteristic. We just saw this last week, where we're going to see this convention this week, and we'll see Harris give her speech and Biden will give his speech, and we will expect that these will be keynotes for what they'll be like. This is what voting for me means. Of course, they'll say some things about the opposition. That's normal, but our expectation is that they will set forth a vision, and they do this also at the outset of their campaign, right? So we saw when they announced Harris as the vice presidential candidate, she then gave her speech, sort of like she outlined what her priorities are and what she cares about, right? 4 years ago, when Donald Trump announced his presidency, he created this phrase, "Make America Great Again," which, of course, me saying it, I know there are people like, I don't even talk about it, but just from an objective standpoint, he set forth, like, this is the tenor of how I want to run this thing and what it'll look like, and these are the issues that I'm going to be sort of running on, right? This is what candidates do, right? Now, Jesus isn't a candidate for office, but the idea that Matthew sets forth is, Matthew is trying to set Jesus in front of his audience, in front of Matthew's audience, not Jesus' audience, Matthew's audience, which are essentially first century Jewish Christians, first century Jews who have come to accept Jesus as the Messiah. Matthew is writing the story that is the case for Jesus as Messiah of God, Messiah, Israel's Messiah, the Messiah that God sends for Israel. That's what Matthew's trying to accomplish. Okay, so he does this. When you look at Matthew, the very first thing Matthew starts with is a genealogy. And that genealogy begins with Abraham, but it refers to Jesus as the son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, who's Abraham? Abraham is the first of Israel. Abraham is the beginner of Israel, really. Abraham's acceptance of God's call and the beginning of that covenant, that relationship, is the genesis of the people that are called Israel. And so he points Jesus immediately through Abraham, son of David, son of Abraham. David, the prophecy is that the Messiah of Israel will come through the line of David. So the first thing Matthew does is do a genealogy, which is not just clerical records, but really a spiritual remembrance of the line that got us from here to there, lives lived. And there's a lot to the genealogy, but you didn't ask about that, so I'll have to talk about that at another time. The point is that whole first part is to set up Jesus as Davidic, in the line of David, in the line of Abraham, Davidic promise, Abrahamic fulfillment, covenant fulfillment, Messiah of God for Israel. Got it? Okay. The Magi, or as we sometimes say, wise men or wise folk, show up to acknowledge this. This is an important thing, but it's essentially it's other outside forces, outside people, Gentiles, noticing and recognizing what's happening, even when Israel doesn't. So we call that foreshadowing, right? We have a connection of Jesus as a child to Moses, fleeing and returning to Egypt, and then we immediately go into chapter 3, which is John the Baptist foretelling of Jesus, and Jesus gets baptized, heads out into the wilderness, comes back and begins his ministry in chapter 4, and then in chapter 5 you have the Sermon on the Mount, and it goes chapters 5, 6, 7, 3 chapters, 3 straight chapters of Jesus teaching, nothing else, just teaching, not interspersed with healing, not in any sort of interactions, just Jesus teaching. Okay? So before we even get into what the Beatitudes say, where are they, based on where they're located in the story of Jesus, what's happening? Matthew has laid out the foundation that Jesus is divinely appointed Messiah of God, and as it says in his baptism, right? The voice from heaven, "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." So we have Jesus is being set up as the Messiah of Israel, accepted even by people outside Israel as something divine and unique, not necessarily recognized by the Israelite power structure. Okay, all of this is foreshadowing for what's to come. And then the acknowledgement that also he is divine, Son of God. Okay, this is big. Yeah. Okay, then he starts to teach, starts to amass some followers, but that's chapter 4. It's very vague, or I should say it's very generalized. Chapter 5, boom. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers," Leslie, "for they will be called children of God." Oh, Life of Brian is on Netflix right now. You can just watch it on Netflix for free. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you When people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And then he goes on, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything, but it's thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. And then, I may actually just read the whole thing. I'm not gonna, but I might, but I won't, but I could. So Jesus starts to say these things that are inherently subversive to the way that we understand God's action in the world and ourselves in relation to God. So the very next thing he says is, do not think that I have come to abolish the law, the Torah, or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter, not one iota is the actual term, because iota is a Greek letter. Not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. And he goes on. But I'm going to stop there, because he recognizes that what he's saying might be taken as in some way a subversion of the Torah, of the law of God. But we have our foundation here, the opening lines, the mission statement or the vision that Jesus has for the world in this sermon, right? It is beautiful. I agree, Lisa. And I want to start not before, but as a way of approaching your question. Is he talking about what it'll be like in heaven, as in that the meek will inherit the earth, that those that are hungry for hunger and thirst for righteousness will be filled, that those who are merciful receive mercy? Is he talking about like the future, or how we live now, or what? Notice first and foremost that Jesus is saying that these things are blessed, like right now, right? So he's not saying you will be blessed. He's saying you are blessed. This in and of itself, first and foremost, that Jesus would call those who mourn, those who are poor in spirit, those who are meek, those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, that those people would be considered blessed, is radical. Because first of all, blessing is not abstract in the Bible. Blessing is a real tangible thing. It is a benefit, oftentimes used, especially in the Old Testament. We're studying Genesis on Thursday mornings. It's material. I mean, the blessings Abraham gets from God are land, wealth, a heritage, which we might go, well, that seems sort of shallow. It's not shallow. It's survival. God's promising God's protection and the survival not only of Abraham, but of his kin, that they would have a place and a relationship that denotes, and a status, I should say, in the world that denotes a special relationship with your maker. That's not shallow. Those are the things that we all still want. I mean, what are we talking about? Security and stability, and to know that we matter to God. Get in line. Like I'm in line for that. Are you in line for that too? Isn't that the thing? It's not just blessed like you're doing okay. It's not just blessed like a tap on the shoulder, right? It is the term blessing comes from, and I'm not going to do the whole like etymology thing, but it comes from essentially God's face is shining upon you. It's where we get that phrase, right? And we heard Liz Clemens sing this so beautifully on Sunday, right? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you with favor and grant you peace. This is an example of Hebrew parallelism. It's they don't rhyme words, they rhyme images. And so you have the Lord bless you and keep you, right? The next line is actually just sort of like an enumeration of that, or a sort of a fleshing out. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you is the same thing as bless you and keep you. They mean the same thing, because that's what blessing is. It is God looking upon you favorably. The idea that if God looks upon you favorably, that you would receive, that it would be, that you could see it, that it would be obvious in your life. This is why, by the way, the prosperity gospel has such teeth, even though you and I know that it's a heresy. The reason that it works in people's minds is because they feel like they can see a tangible proof that God is blessing them. And there is not nothing to that. There's something to that. Even if I disagree with it, it's not baseless. It's problematic, it's wrong, it's a lot of things, but it's based in an idea that actually makes sense, which is that God's face looking upon you favorably will result in something actual in your life. And so that's why we're still struggling years later with the idea of, then if I'm suffering, does that mean God doesn't love me or bless me? And if I'm, so only the people who are doing well are blessed, and only the people who are doing poorly are. And then when you've done something, if you're not doing well, must mean that you've done something to anger God, right? This is a tension that's present in our ancient scriptures. Job, which some people believe is the earliest book in the Bible, actually, is all about that question. What does it mean when bad things happen to good people? So we have some tension that's already arisen here. Jesus starts his ministry. Am I going too fast? So blessing, God looking upon you favorably, right? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you, be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you with favor and grant you his peace. When you hear that, all three of those lines are actually the same thing, restated 3 different times. The one, the maker of all, looks upon you with favor. Now what? What happens to you? Okay. Now there's language. There's that Job story of, well, bad things happen to good people too. But it is right up against and alongside in our Old Testament, Deuteronomy, which says, if y'all will do right, not just you personally, but y'all as a people will do right, God will make you prosper. And if y'all do, and if you all ignore the guidelines of this covenant that we've created together, then you're going to know it. But this got translated a lot to, if you, Lisa, are faithful, then God will give you things and make your life good. And if something goes wrong in your finances or with your family or in your body, then you probably need to check yourself for something wrong with your relationship with God. That's what happened with it. That was so commonly accepted that when there's the story in John of Jesus and his disciples walking along, and they see a blind man who was blind from birth, and the disciples' first thought is, so Jesus, just hypothetically speaking, just so we understand, like, whose fault is it that he's blind? Is it because of something he did or something his parents did? The question isn't if anybody did anything wrong to the disciples. The question is, who did the wrong thing that made the bad thing happen? And Jesus shuns the whole concept. He won't have it. But that's what he's up against. And in case we want to go in some weird zone where we think that's just something Jews did or Israelites, ancient Israel did, this is human. This is a human thing, right? If people are doing good just to get into God's favor, how is that different from doing good because you're a decent human being and you don't want others to hurt? I'm going to come back to that because it's a good question. I'm already this close to being sidetracked by my own mind when it comes to this this Beatitudes thing. So Leslie, this is a phenomenal question. We will talk about it today. When Jesus starts his public ministry with this mission, this statement of, not actually mission, this is a vision, with a statement of a vision of what he sees as the kingdom of God and how it works. And he starts with you being a blessing. You are the salt of the earth. But the first thing he says is, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger. And Lisa, you're right. It still feels radical today. I think that's telling about our inability to learn from it, and about the eternal nature of God's blessing, how it continues to be radical thousands of years down the line. But the idea that Jesus is setting forth from the beginning of his ministry is that blessing, God's favor and presence, is found in places that that are not commonly accepted or expected. That it's really, really, really similar to the Black Lives Matter conversation, actually, right? Because you've seen you must have by now seen the meme or the cartoon that says, like, Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit, and someone goes, no, blessed are all people, Jesus. It's actually, that's the idea. Like, he's pointing out not that only these people are blessed. That's not what he's doing. But he starts his public description, his public ministry, with a description of blessing in places where it's not normally seen. People don't recognize God's blessing upon those who are in mourning. People aren't recognizing God's blessing on those in the presence of the lives of those who hunger and thirst for justice. They say if God was present and blessing those people, then they wouldn't be mourning, right? Then they wouldn't need to thirst or hunger for justice. So Jesus is turning this on its head. Okay? Jesus is shining a light on the reality that blessing, that the favorable presence of God, which manifests itself in your life in real and tangible ways, is there in those who mourn, in those who are poor in spirit, in those who are persecuted, in those who hunger and thirst for his name's sake. For those who are hunger and thirst for justice and are persecuted for his name's sake, for those who, for peacemakers, for meek people. Meek, by the way, one of the least understood words in our scriptures. People confuse meek for weak, or meek for sort of passive and being a doormat. Meek is a word, look it up. It's a word about restraint. It's a word about the restraint of someone who has the choice to act out and chooses not to. The choice to restrain oneself rather than to lash out or use all their power to crush someone. Jesus is meek. Jesus is not weak. And I'm sure some of you have experienced the choice of being meek. And that's not about being weak, right? So for Jesus to locate God's presence and blessing in these unusual places at the outset of his ministry tells us, by the way, and he's the Messiah, the Son of God, tells us that Israel's deliverance is going to be found differently than they expected. That the deliverance of God's people, the salvation of God's people, is real. They will. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They will be comforted. They will inherit the earth. They will be filled. They will receive mercy. They will see God. They will be called children of God. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Great is their reward. The promise of God's making things right is lasting. It's not going anywhere. This is a messianic thing. This will be fulfilled. Remember, he says, I didn't come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. The fulfillment is on its way. It's happening in Jesus. And it's going to look different than you expect. You thought maybe that if your country or people were blessed, there wouldn't even be poor in spirit people or meek people or need for peacemakers. Jesus is saying that these things, these people are present, and in them you can see God's work. In your suffering, God is blessing you. That doesn't mean God is causing you to suffer so that you can be blessed. Those are different. They are different. But the idea that because you are suffering, you will be you aren't blessed. And you need to get through that suffering before you can recognize blessing. That's what has to change. And Lisa asks a question, so we almost have to stand and fall or rise collectively. Yeah, we are a collective of individuals. I grew up with a very individualistic mindset. Salvation was something I get for me. I don't know what happens to you. Good luck. I know what my relationship with Jesus is like. I don't know about yours. So, I mean, I very much grew up in I know where I'm going when I die, do you? Sort of mentality. And that extended, as it should, if you're consistent, to my philosophy on life and the world. I think as an adult, in my reapproaching of my faith, I have been attentive to the reality that God calls not a person but a people. And that salvation is not just for one person but a group. That it's for a people, and that salvation ends up looking like living into covenant. It looks like a commonwealth. It looks like where all people are okay and well treated. Now, I'm going to stop short of saying that's collectivism. I will, because there's still just enough of an American individualist in me to not do that. But genuinely, I think there's a false dichotomy that we live into which we live, which is either individualism or collectivism. I think that we go down both of those roads and we lose the complexity of real human life and experience by choosing one or the other. The reality is we are a collective of individuals, and both things matter about us. We are individuals having individual experiences, and yet we are completely interconnected and interdependent, and we were made for it. We were made by coupling, right? I mean, we were made by more than one person, and we are social by nature. Even the most introverted of us, the shyest of us, is social. I mean, it's a reality that even if you're not social, like I want to hang out with people all the time, your life is, you are social in the sense that like your life is dependent on others and theirs is dependent on you. So each of us has personal accountability and responsibility. Our personal accountability and responsibility is towards the body. And the health of the body is real and matters. And it depends on the health of the individual. And the health of the individual depends on the health of the collective, the body. So it really is not an either or. It really is a both and reality. That Jesus is speaking both to people on an individual level and to something that they are meant to look for in their culture. What does a culture look like that recognizes the blessing of those who mourn, that sees them as in a place of honor? Where we wouldn't be ashamed of our tears? What kind of culture? where we wouldn't be afraid to show people our grief? What kind of culture where when we see people who are fighting, who hunger and thirst for justice, as the people we look up to the most? What kind of culture where we see meek people, people who instead of running their mouths and tearing people down, bridle their tongues on their own volition and choose silence over cruelty, restraint over unmitigated sort of polemicism? What kind of culture would we be if we recognized that they were the people who inherited the earth? Right? If we saw someone who is poor in spirit as closer to God in some ways than we are when we are happy, how would that change the way we understood ourselves and our God? Everyone I'm talking to right now that's watching, that I know, those of you that I know that are on right now, you've all experienced difficulty, as have I. What if you saw your ability to feel that grief as part of the blessing of being alive rather than as something that was shameful or needing to get past as quickly as possible? What if you recognized when you thought of yourself in the lowest of places? Doesn't mean you want to hang out there, I get it. But what if part of healing wasn't how do I get out of this as quickly as possible and go back to being quote unquote normal? What if we created a culture that was able to recognize your blessing and your beauty and your belongingness in whatever state of being you were? What if our history books were not primarily filled with the exploits of conquerors and people who took things by force in wars? Because think about what we learned in history. It's almost entirely that. What if we primarily studied those who ended wars and brought peace? How might that look different for us? It would be different, wouldn't it? Am I describing a different kind of reality? This kind of reality is the reign of God, the kingdom of God, the realm, the God reality in on earth as it is in heaven. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, I haven't still totally directly answered your question, Lisa. When does it happen? And I think this is true. I think part of it is I've needed to set the table the way I have and kind of give you all this context. But I think another part of it is the answer is not simple. And it's not obvious. I do think you said, is it possible that it's both and? And I do. I think it's a descriptor of heaven. But our prayer is thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Which means we're also describing what a reconciled earth will look like. And what I will say is once you accept this vision of the world as what it's meant to be and what we're moving towards, what God is moving us towards, then you begin to have eyes in the world and in your own life for where that's actually happening, and you begin to make space for it, right? So the shallowest of examples of possible, when you realize what kind of new shoes you want to get, you start seeing everybody wearing those shoes, right? Or when you realize what kind of car you want your next car to be, you start to see that car everywhere. Are there more of them? No, you just recognize it now. If you have eyes for the kingdom as described here, you can start to see where the kingdom is breaking in and the places where God's kingdom come and the places where God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. If you have the vision that Jesus is laying forth here, and you begin to, and you believe, and you seek to believe that this is the kind of reality that God is ushering into being now on earth, however slowly, however frustratingly slowly, you will start to see it and you will start to work for it. And you will ask the question, instead of when everything's falling apart, instead of saying, when will this all end so God can bless me? You can start to wonder where God will be blessing you in the midst of your sorrow and grief, difficulty and frustration. Right? Leslie says, every experience changes you. It's up to you to decide whether to take that change and make it a positive part of you, or to try to hide it away and ignore it. So Leslie, I started some form of psychoanalysis about a year and a half ago. And I was doing the work, and about 6 months in, a little sooner than that, but then I kept like 6 months in, I asked again, I asked repeatedly, okay, so why am I doing this? I like the work, but why am I doing this? Psychoanalysis is different than just basic therapy. Basic therapy is localized, similar to physical therapy. You go in for a specific thing, right? Oh, my shoulder hurts when I do this. And they go physical therapy. Oh, well, don't do that. No, do this. And they teach you how to do this thing. And okay, great. So therapy is kind of like that. I've got this issue with this thing. All right, well, let's talk it through there. Okay. So psychoanalysis is more like a long-term process of uncovering that which is within you, that the things you've experienced that have shaped you. And not all of them are good. In fact, a lot of them aren't. There's trauma. And our natural instinct oftentimes is to hide it away and ignore it, as you said in your language. And this creates, so right now I have my knee's acting up. So I have to walk on it differently, and I have to favor the other knee, right? What am I doing? I'm changing my behavior to compensate for an injury that I haven't bothered to fix. Right? So your whole body starts acting out of whack because you're compensating for one thing, right? Well, it's similar with our psyches, right? So we have all sorts of stuff that we have not acknowledged or dealt with. And this has caused us to have disorders in other ways that we approach the world, because it's all interconnected, right? So the goal is to what? Is to bring this stuff to the front, to acknowledge it, to deal with it, to accept certain aspects of yourself, and then to integrate them into your life, right? Integrate them into your consciousness so that you're not subconsciously making, dysfunctional moves just because, dad said this thing to you when you were 5 or whatever the thing might be, right? And I'm not trying to minimize their real traumas we experience, right? So similarly, what does a Christian culture look like that openly and actively acknowledges the things which have changed us, both positively and negatively, and acknowledges God's presence in all of them? How does that shift the way that we interact with them? And I think Jesus is moving in that specific direction here. I think he's causing us to go in that way. And I think that the Christian promise is that, yes, there is a heaven. And you will experience this fully there. But I think it's also an acknowledgement that the work is being done here on earth, and that God is pushing us closer and closer towards this reality. So Leslie asks a question. If nothing else, I was going to get to your question, but if nothing else, trauma teaches us how to support others who have gone through similar situations, and also how to not do things like that to others. I had this conversation with my 9-year-old daughter, right? Because she's been through a lot as a 9-year-old. She's had some physical maladies. She's had some surgeries. She's had some difficulties. She's had to be moved across country. She's been through the ringer for a 9-year-old. And so we talked a little bit about that. And one of the things I said to her was, the good news is, the bad news is I can't tell you why all this stuff happened. I don't know. But the good news is that I can tell you that because you've experienced this, you have the capacity to be there for other people in a different way. And that is really exciting. And she was like, what do you mean? I told her, and she was like, oh, like I could talk to people about this thing because I've experienced this. And I was like, yeah, that's right. And she actually thought that was super cool. So yeah, I think there's a place for that, you know? Okay, now back to your question from a few minutes ago, Leslie. If people are doing good, quote unquote, just to get into God's favor, how is that different from doing good because you're a decent human being and you don't want others to hurt? Okay. I guess I think that the difference is everything and nothing at the same time. Because here's the deal. If I'm drowning and you save me, but you save me just so you can get the credit, do I care or am I just psyched to be alive? Right? So one of my kids was born with a cleft lip and palate. We had to choose a surgeon. We had a choice, actually, between these two surgeons that were on this team. And one guy, they said, had done like 450 of them, was basically the best in Orange County, California. He's Southern California plastic surgeon. If he's the best there, he's probably one of the best around, right? Ever. The other guy was also quite good. Had done, I think, only 100 or 150 of these repairs. And they were like, well, the guy who's done 450 of them and is the best, he doesn't have the best bedside manner. He's not always the nicest guy. And I was like, I can't fathom caring about that. I want the person who's going to do the best job. Now, that's my attitude. There could be people who go, well, the other guy does fine, and this is a tough process. I need to have someone that I feel is not a jerk going through this with me, right? So the options are real. They're genuine things. But I mean, there's that piece that's like, hey, listen, if the job gets done, like, I just want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that there's room for, if you're doing the right thing and getting the job done, then are we really going to harp on if you were the right kind of person doing it, right? But also, and I also want to push back a little bit against the idea that there's such a thing as a decent person. In the sense that I think that like there's a lot of decent people who are also not decent. There's a lot of people like me who try to do really good and also screw up and also are petty and rude and mean sometimes. That's pretty normal, and that the idea of like the right kind of person actually creates a dilemma for us. I want to suggest that we are talking about relationship. The orientation of the people of Israel in the Bible, God's people, is that they are made by God and for relationship with God. The commandments that are a part of the covenant with the people Israel, the ways that they are meant to live their lives, are given to them after, not before or during, after they are saved. And theirs is a literal saving. They are slaves in Egypt. And God delivers them from slavery. And then says, you're my people. And since we're in this thing together, I want to talk to you about what it looks like for you to live as if that's true. Let's talk about how you will construct your lives and your society such that it is evident, obvious, manifest in your constructed life that you are living in a way that is in connection with the God who made all things. Okay? So God's already saved. And the way that you were and so really what we're talking about in terms of your actions towards others is how you choose to live in response to the reality of what God has done and is doing and will do in your life. God's faithfulness is a guarantee. Faithfulness to you is a given according to God. How will you live now that you know this is true? Right? So I think this is a really important distinction. If we're just doing good so that we can get God's favor, this is why, look, part of the story is you can do all the good you want, and it doesn't necessarily mean that all is going to work out for you the way you like. If your whole thing is just to try to impress God, I would say that, the truth will out, as it were. I will also say if your goal is to impress God, maybe you keep doing the good thing and God changes you within that. Maybe you become a lifeguard so that you can be, so that you can be a big deal on the beach, and people will look at you and go, look at his or her body. Aren't they hot? Aren't they amazing? And oh, wow, they saved all these people. But maybe the act of saving people over and over and over again changes you. Can't imagine it wouldn't. The act, for whatever reason that you do it, of living for others in some way, how might it change you and transform you should you let it? So I want to leave a little gray area. I want to leave a little room there for nuance. You could still spend your whole life doing the right thing and be a jerk, I guess, and not get it. That's true. Or you could be a person who rarely ever does what we would call the right thing, but is genuinely seeking to understand God. And that's the point, is it's not all that simple. And Jesus' teaching is meant to acknowledge the complexity of our lives in response to God's presence. Right? So Lisa says, we're looking at wonderful, life-changing people who seek justice, love, relationship, but who are not Christians. They often restore more than judgmental people. So does it matter with whom or if you identify with Jesus? Some of the holiest people I know are not religious. They are morally guided. Great. So here's the deal. I follow Jesus because I believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. And if that's real, then, and I believe it's real, I have no choice but to orient my life around that. If God showed up on earth, if I believe that God showed up on earth and lived and died and came back to life in a very specific way on behalf of me and you and all those people you're talking about who aren't religious, all the people who aren't us, that God did that for everybody, how could that not affect the way that I live my life? Now, what about people who don't believe in Jesus? It's above my pay grade, and I'm not being sarcastic. Of course, at the beginning of the story, we are saying there are people outside of our tribe who recognize God's presence and blessing in ways we can't. That's a big part of the gospel story. So could it still be true today? Of course it's true. Now here's where, if Jesus is real and not just an idea, and if the resurrection is an actual event that happened in the history of this world and not just a metaphor that helps me create a moral guide, if that's true, then all the things that are said about Jesus are true. Then our friends who aren't Christian, whenever they do works of justice and love, and are holy, they are doing that in relationship with Jesus, whether they believe in Jesus or not. That's if Jesus is real. Hear me out, right? All good things to the Christian, our understanding is all good things are happening through and by the power of Jesus. Not just because you consciously decide that you follow Jesus is true. All good things, all that is good and beautiful and right in the world is good and beautiful and right because of the work of Jesus Christ. That doesn't mean you have to believe it for it to be true. I don't need to believe that the sun's there for me to experience the sun. Right? There are people who believe in a flat earth. The earth is round whether or not they believe in it. Right? That's not fair, by the way. I got to be careful because that sounds like I'm saying if you don't believe in Jesus, you're a flat earther. I don't mean it like that. What I mean to say is what you believe about God does not actually, either Jesus is real or he's not. My believing in Jesus is not the thing that makes Jesus real or not. Okay, this isn't the never-ending story, right? Like where Fantasia exists or whatever that area is called because we believe in it enough and then it's real. And if you don't believe in it, it disappears. If God is the God of our scriptures is real, then no amount of us believing or disbelieving in that God changes the reality of that God's realness. Right? So I have no problem at all with the idea because I've seen it and I know it, and it'd be stupid to deny it. I have no problem with the reality that all sorts of people outside of the Christian tradition are amazing, fantastic, wonderful, and know things experientially about God that I don't know experientially because of my own short-sightedness, because of my own limitations, because of my own laziness, because of my own pettiness. There are so many things I don't understand about God as a Christian. Okay? But I am saying, as a Christian, I believe this to be true about God in Jesus Christ. I believe these things to be true about Jesus. And that must change the way that I live my life. I'm not talking about Jews, Muslims, Hindus, atheists, Sikhs. I'm not talking about them. Good or bad. My statement it's not about that. It's a separate conversation, right? I am saying that the Christian believes this thing to be true about Jesus. If it's true, then all the good that we see is happening through Jesus. And that means that Jesus is at work in all of these people outside of our boxes. That's not the same as saying all religions are the same. And it's not the same as saying whatever you believe is true is true. And you could say that. You could say all religions are the same or whatever you want to believe. They're all just different paths of the same mountain. You are welcome to that. I am not saying it. I am setting I'm trying to describe a worldview where I believe Christianity is accurate, true, and factual. That the event of Jesus is a factual reality in the world, and that we are all living in the aftermath, in the reality where we're experiencing a world, a cosmos that is being reconciled by Jesus, and that we're all responding and reacting to it differently. And that people of different religions are not excluded from the grace of God, nor are they excluded from being able to show all people what faithfulness looks like, what justice looks like. I would suggest that when anyone in this world is doing the just thing, they are partnering with Jesus. That's the Christian sort of like line. That is as far as I can understand it. There are Christians who would say, you have to say these things are true about Jesus or everything you do is empty. I don't buy it. And I think, Lisa, that's where a little bit of what you're getting at comes from. I don't buy it. That you have to confess Jesus as Lord in a active and conscious way, or everything you do is meaningless and empty. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. But I also don't buy that you just, whatever you believe is true, and we all just can believe whatever we want, and as long as we don't hurt anybody, we're okay. That's basically therapeutic moral deism. We got to move past that, right? Be a good person and don't hurt anybody, and then that's the whole thing. Well, it's not the whole thing. It's a good thing. We want to talk about that, but it's not the whole thing. You've said, and those who believe exactly that thing that you mentioned, but do not engage in love, justice, community. If Jesus is real and the resurrection is an actual event, but your behavior is not altered. Oh, I agree. If your life is not transformed, then you don't believe, regardless of what you say out of your mouth. I don't care. I don't. And that's all of us. This is the condemnation that comes down upon all of us, is that if we are not willing to allow our lives to be influenced and altered by the God of all creation, then we are lying when we say we believe in that God, because that God calls us to be transformed. Yeah. I've said this before. You've heard me say it before. There's a writer, and it's this, and I quote the same thing about him every time. He'll be like, I've said other things. You did, Pete, but they weren't all as good as this thing. His name's Peter Rollins, and he said a bunch of good stuff. But the best thing that I've read him say, and I heard him say it in person, was, he was writing all this stuff, and people were like, "Do you even believe in the resurrection?" Because he was dealing with evangelicals, because he was a former evangelical. And people, "Do you believe in the resurrection?" And he would say, "No." What? And he said, "If I don't love my enemy and if I don't pray for those who persecute me, I don't believe in the resurrection. If I don't follow the Beatitudes and live as if they're real, if I don't seek God's kingdom here on earth, then I don't believe in the resurrection. My belief will be shown forth in my actions." What do you believe? Your actions tell us what you believe. The other stuff's just aspirational. Your actions tell us what you believe, right? That's the thing. Our beliefs, our actions matter. They matter. And also, we cannot be flawless. Okay? So let's get over that idea too. We cannot be flawless. So that's the tricky thing, is people like us who get involved in the conversations, Christians like us who want to start talking about justice and putting your money where your mouth is and doing the work, we also have the capacity to be the least forgiving of others. And that's problematic. And the least forgiving of ourselves, because I'm supposed to be a certain way. And this is where grace comes in. We have to be a people of grace and not just a people of action. We have to not just be holding ourselves accountable all the time. We have to understand that grace and accountability are partners. They're not at odds with one another, and one is not more important than the other. Grace and accountability go hand in hand. They actually empower and care for one another in a properly ordered Christian life. And so we want to understand grace with accountability, and we want to understand accountability with grace. Except for Leslie, who's pretty great. You are actually pretty great. I want to move us away from conversations where we worry basically about who's right and who's good. Is actually the thing. Who's the right kind of person and the wrong kind of person. And I want us to move towards an understanding of how God is living in the world and how we can react and respond to that God. We've been given a picture. And maybe I should have stopped talking and just read the whole Sermon on the Mount from beginning to end. We'd get a sense of just how radical that picture is. It's transformative. It's life-changing, because that's what Jesus is doing to those who would follow him, right? All right, I'm going to stop. It looks like I'm 5 minutes past time. And you know me, I want to talk about music for a second. I've been listening to this album a lot lately. I've had it forever, but lately, it's a Frank Sinatra album. It's Frank Sinatra and Carlos Jobim, who was a bossa nova, one of the sort of fathers of bossa nova music. Brazilian badass, great bossa nova music. And the album is literally called Francis Albert Sinatra and Carlos Antonio Jobim. That's the name of the album. And it's amazing. It's really like mellow, but not like boring. A lot's going on, and it's got me lately. I named my dog Francis, and so I went back and listened to that album because of that, and I've just been listening to it nonstop. Probably gonna listen to it when I'm done with this. So you should check that out. Listening to Run the Jewels, their newest album. It's pretty great. It's pretty hardcore and fantastic. I need to listen to it some more. And continuing to listen to just boatloads of Ella Fitzgerald. And my daughter got a Discman, people. And she's been borrowing my CDs and listening to the Traveling Wilburys and my one Taylor Swift CD. And we've been talking a lot about T Swift. And she wanted to listen to Bob Dylan. This is going really well for me. I also lent her Stevie Wonder talking book and Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who's a blues gospel guitarist, so I can start to teach her about some good music, right? We get to work on her. All right, team. So much love, all my love. Thanks for being here today. And we'll do it again next week. Invite your folks, invite people, and ask me questions. Send me thoughts, and we'll keep it going. We'll just do this until we can't do it anymore, right? All right. I'll talk to you soon. Be well.